Hi, everyone. Hope you are enjoying the SE Magazine e-Symposium today, Insiders with Access, and I am pleased to welcome you to our next session, Detect the Enemy Within with User Activity Monitoring, brought to you by Spectrasoft. I'm your moderator, Dan Kaplan, Executive Editor of SE Magazine, and let's see what we're going to talk about today. Most of the data breach headlines we've seen here about every day involve a mysterious hacker or hackers burning their way into a corporate network from the outside with the goal of stealing information. But what gets covered much less, but often is just as damaging to an organization, is an insider incident in which a person with trusted access, often usually an employee, is the cause of the breach, either on purpose or by accident. And what makes these breaches difficult to discover is that often this employee didn't need any vulnerabilities or exploits or hacking tools to perpetrate the theft. They already had the inside track thanks to their credentialing and privileges. Today we are going to hear from Nick Cavalencia, who is the VP of Marketing at Spectrasoft, and he's going to talk about how technology can help define, address, and detect an insider who is up to no good. After Nick talks, we're going to have some time for Q&A, so get those questions in as we move along, and I will now pass it over to Nick. Nick, welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Much appreciated. So welcome, everyone. In talking about detecting the enemy within, what I want to do just really briefly is really quickly tell you about Spectrasoft. We make software products that monitor employee and system activity. We audit this activity, providing you with visibility and intelligence into those actions that are usually involved with, you can kind of see on the list there, data theft, employee fraud, data breaches, and so on. And so that's about all that I want to talk about for Spectrasoft. Let's actually move on and kind of talk about those three aspects that Dan touched on just briefly that we're going to discuss today. I first want to define the enemy. The enemy actually has kind of a profile, a persona. There's commonalities throughout, and I want to talk about what that looks like. And then talk about the products that are being used today traditionally to address the enemy, and then talk about what you can do to actually detect the enemy as proactively as is possible. So the first thing in defining the enemy is, who is the enemy? And of course, we're talking about an employee. Could, of course, be like a contractor, but I'm just generically calling them an employee. And they could have malicious intent. They also, as Dan even kind of implied at the beginning, they could be the unintentional or unwitting participant in some external scheme that's going on. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're probably more going to focus on the insiders that have that access, that have some malicious intent to take the access they've been given and use it to their own gain. And that's kind of the definition here that we want to use. So the first activity that an enemy might be getting involved with would be corporate fraud. The ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, put out their report late last year, and you can see some of the stats that are on there that kind of dictate what employee fraud looks like. 5% of your revenues get lost annually. The median loss is $140,000, which I believe about 25% of the losses were over $1 million in this survey they had done. And then the most important thing here to note is the median time to discover the fraud is 18 months. There was just a news article in the paper, online, and listen to me on the paper, online not more than a week or two ago about a woman who had been writing fake payroll checks for 7 years and stole over $400,000. And the only reason she was caught was not because they did an audit or something like that. It was because the woman at the bank, the bank teller, saw one of the names on the checks and said, I know that person. I don't think that's their signature, and then tipped authorities, and then the person got in trouble and got arrested. And that just makes the case here. 18 months to discover is probably not even the norm. It's probably even longer, and that's why detection becomes so important. The second one here is data theft. Verizon every year puts out their data breach investigations report. And in there you can see that they've cited that, for IP theft as an example, 46% of the time it involves an insider. So it's not just external, it's insiders that have access to this data. Who's normally involved? You can see some of the stats here: finance and accounting, human resources. If I jump to the last one, executive and upper management. And the interesting thing here with this is those departments that are listed, if you cross-reference that with the ACFE data, 77% of the time in the ACFE data, they take 6 departments that include finance, accounting, human resources, and so on. And 77% of the time, those 6 departments are the ones involved with corporate fraud. So there's almost like a pattern here that's starting to build up. You also see that 28% of the time, just a regular employee, someone who's a low-level employee with low-level access, gains basically takes some information or commits data theft. There was just a story last week of a Palm Beach County Health Department worker stole 111 records that included Social Security numbers, and she was just an entry clerk that had access. Now, the interesting thing about the data theft is actually in the time frames that are involved. In the data breach investigations report, they actually list out the time it takes to both have a breach take place, the data theft take place, as well as a discovery. And they do it in increments of literally seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, and months and years. They broke it down, like what is the time frame. And the staggering part, first off, is that for breaches, it only takes seconds to hours for 77% of the time. Now, putting that in perspective, you think of someone, let's say, copying a file to a USB stick that has all of our customer records on it. How long does it really take? Seconds to maybe a minute, and kind of making this up as I go along, but it fits in the seconds to hours category. It doesn't take very long. Now, the part that really puts this in perspective is how long it takes to discover. Half the time it was in months to years. So you can see that even kind of corresponds with the ACFE data of saying 18 months being the median time frame. This stuff happens all the time, and it takes months to years to be detected in the first place. That is where it's really damaging, is the damage has been done. The Social Security numbers are out. The medical record data is out. And intellectual property is gone, that kind of thing. It's necessary to be able to discover this in a much, much shorter time frame that is close to the time it takes for the breach to take place itself. So the enemy is involved in corporate fraud and data theft. The next one would be compliance breaches. I pulled some data here from the Health and Human Services OCR data, and for 2012, looked at all the breaches that were involved and kind of categorized them here. And you can see that 56% of the time theft was involved, 22% unauthorized access. And that's kind of interesting here because we're talking about insiders with access. So obviously in that case, we're talking more about someone that's using another person's credentials, so it does happen. Just loss 14% of the time. There was a story out today of someone that had copied one file to a USB stick that contained 6,000 patient records, and they lost the USB stick. Something as simple as that. And that happens as well. And by the way, these don't add up to 100% because there's overlap. There might be literally a HIPAA breach that involved unauthorized access and theft. And so it's not 56 plus 22 plus 14 and so on adding up to 100. These are just the percentage of the time that those particular breach types were involved in a breach. Now, the other thing that's interesting is I look to see when computers were involved or if it was just paper that was involved and that kind of thing. And you find that 67% of the time that it's computer-related. And the computer-related includes computers, laptops, email, a medical record system, network server, portable storage. Some also involved paper in conjunction because obviously if I want to print something, it involved the computer and paper. But this tells you the enemy, the employee that's doing this kind of stuff, they're using their computer, plain and simple. We know that. That's where the source is. You need to pay very close attention to that. Another reason why they're so successful at compliance breaches is out of the Verizon data breach investigations report, they had asked a number of questions about those that were under PCI compliance and said, now by the way, just some preface here, these questions were asked of organizations that had a PCI compliance breach. So keep that in mind. They already had a breach. Ouch, something bad happened. And then they got asked, okay, how many of you are developing secure systems? Only a fifth of them said they are. This is bad. How many of you have need-to-know access? Basically look at your role and give you just the access you need. Only about a third of them. Unique identifiers, unique IDs, usernames and passwords, 20%. Tracking and monitoring access, only 11%. And then the one that's most staggering, I forgot to put it here on the slide, was the percentage of them that actually say they regularly test their security systems and processes. 6% are actually regularly testing it. And so some of you may actually even fall into that category where you think you're secure, but are you really testing it? Are you tracking and monitoring access on a daily basis, setting up alerts, this kind of thing? And so this is one of the reasons why compliance breaches and maybe even theft and corporate fraud are so, I'm going to call it easy, for lack of a better term. The last one I want to talk about in defining the enemy is one that isn't security related, but I think it's important just to kind of mention because of the fact that it does affect the bottom line of an organization. That's employee productivity. Salary.com did a study early in 2012, and it asked employees how much time per week do you spend on personal sites during work. Now you can see the graph. And at first glance, you're going to say, come on, Nick. I mean, come on, 39%. 40% of people are less than an hour. Who cares? And I thought that, too, when I first looked at the graph. But then I thought, wait a second. I mean, that adds up to 100%, all those percentages. What if I apply that to a 100-person company, just a fictitious 100-person company, and assume that they're using that much time on the Internet? What does that look like? And just for kind of full disclosure, since I have ranges of times there on the left-hand side of the chart, I averaged them out. So like less than an hour, which is 0 minutes to an hour, I made it half an hour in my calculation. For 1 to 2 hours, I made it 1.5 hours, and so on, with the exception being greater than 10 hours, I just left that at 10 hours. So that way you can kind of see where my numbers are. So if I was to apply that average of those time frames to those percentages in the graph, it would generate for a 100-person company 226 hours of wasted time in a week. To put some perspective on that number, that's the equivalent of 5.6 weeks of someone's time. But to even better make it really clear how much it's impacting a business, if you add that up over a year, that's the equivalent of 6 full-time employees, on the average, being paid to do absolutely nothing for an entire year. I don't know a business on the planet that can afford to pay 6 people to do nothing. So that's the equivalent here. So while, again, it's not security related, it is truly impacting the bottom line, and it's something that also has to be inspected, alerted to, and addressed within an organization. So let's talk about how organizations today are addressing the enemy. And the first part is access. You have identity and access management solutions. And they're, of course, going to make sure that someone, maybe two-factor authentication, that kind of thing, to make sure that people are accessing the right resources and assets that they should be. It's going to help, to truly hone down things like fraud and theft and so on. But it's not going to address the scenario that even Dan went right for at the beginning of this presentation, which is the people that have appropriate access, the insider that already has access to that data. Think back to my example of the Palm Beach County health worker. She was accessing data that she had access to. So IAM isn't entirely going to help, but it does help with part of the problem here. The next one is governance. You want to manage the data and see where it should be going, where it shouldn't be going. And it does it by blocking access to certain mediums, certain destinations, and so on, but always has kind of trouble deciding where, when, and how to stop it. And the reason for that is because it's only as good, and I wrote it this way specifically, your last detected breach. If you plug all the holes you think are holes, it's not until you actually detect a new hole can you update your DLP and make it that much more secure. So you're going to have to be watching to see what people are trying to do and to work around your DLP. For example, if you block USB ports and they suddenly start using Dropbox, if you weren't aware of that, you don't know to block Dropbox. So you've got to be watching that. So DLP definitely is part of the answer, but it's not the entirety of the answer. The next part is network monitoring tools, just monitoring tools in general that are going to be watching network traffic or where they're going on internally as well as externally. They're good in that they're going to provide you some detail, but they lack a couple of bits of insight. As an example of the network monitoring solution, if I don't have something like an SSL proxy built inside in my organization and SSL sessions are starting and originating at the employee's desktop or laptop themselves, I have zero visibility into what's going on when they connect to Gmail. So that means that they can go ahead and attach some file that they just copied from somewhere and send it out to themselves or to a colleague or whomever else, and I have no idea what they actually did, no insight whatsoever. So that becomes kind of a problem. And then I wrote up here on the screen, you can see that you can't police the endpoint itself, USB use or local drives or a DVD burner or whatever the case is. So it helps with part of the problem, addressing it, but it's not going to be complete. And then the last part here I put up here is auditing with SIM. And for those of you that don't know what SIM is, I'm assuming that most of you do, but let's just walk through the logic together. In kind of its simplest form, SIM is designed to take data from various disparate systems and pull it together in an attempt to actually sort of recreate what it was that the employee did. So I have some file server auditing logs from a Windows server that said John went ahead and copied some files or opened some files from a server that had some proprietary data in it. And then I can see from my web logs that he went onto Gmail and it was a lot of data. And you're trying to build and paint the picture of what it was he did. The problem is that at best, SIM kind of ends up being like a game of Clue. For those of you that remember the game of Clue, SIM is going to end up telling you that it was Professor Plum in the library with a candlestick, but there's no context. You really need to have user context of why the user did it, what they did before, what they did after, in order to truly make SIM valuable. Or I should say more valuable than it is even today. And then the other problem, of course, with SIM is it's big and really expensive. It takes a year or so to really get going because you're trying to find all the exceptions amidst the vast amounts of data that you're trying to sort through. So let's give the enemy scorecard here, looking at these solutions, how they match up to the individual types of activities that an enemy might involve themselves in. And I put it like this. I kind of gave some of them kind of half credit and some of them good credit. And let me just walk through it and give me the benefit of the doubt here. You don't have to necessarily agree with me, but I'm just kind of trying to paint the picture. Identity and access management. It's going to help with some fraud, data theft, and compliance because it's going to keep people who should be accessing resources only getting the stuff they need. DLP, good for compliance because you're going to be able to block data from leaving. Maybe a little data theft for sure. Maybe a little bit of fraud, but not if like someone's writing checks in an accounting system they shouldn't be. It's not going to help there. Network monitoring, of course, helps with productivity. I can see who's on Facebook a lot, but only to some degree. And then SIM helps all across the board, but again, it lacks some of that context. So let me introduce you to user activity monitoring just briefly here. And what it does, in essence, is with user activity monitoring, what you're doing is you're putting the equivalent of like a video camera behind the employee from the moment they sit down to the moment they get up. And you get this comprehensive view of everything they do, every keystroke, every application, every chat, every email, you name it, whether it's encrypted, unencrypted, it doesn't matter because you're watching it and you're seeing it as the employee did. And there's three parts to it. The first part is recording what they do. Everything gets recorded. So you have this great visibility and context into every action because nothing's missed. But what makes it really valuable is the alerting. The fact that instead of you having this massive amount of data to go through, you get real-time alerting to the fact that someone just pressed print screen inside the medical records app and you're going, why were they hitting print screen? That's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. Or that someone just copied 50 documents to a USB drive. Why'd you do that? Why'd they print out 30 documents just now? You get alerted. And then the last part is when you need to, then you go and you review the aggregated data and play it back with a screen playback so you can actually see it as the employee did. And see before, during, and after the activity in question. How it differs from all the other solutions and adds benefit, right place, right time. File servers don't commit fraud. Firewalls don't commit data theft, and so on. It's the employee that does it. So if you're sitting in the context of the employee, you're always at the right place at the right time because you saw what they did as they did it. Activities are always in context because I can see, again, before, during, and after the activity in question, so I know why they did it. And then anytime, anywhere, in any medium, anything the employee is involved with on the computer, we can see. You're not blocked by encryption or something like that. If they can see it, we can see it. And then the last part is it's admissible in court. So it allows you to take the appropriate action up to and including if you need to take legal action, you can do so. Firing them is easy, but going beyond that. So the enemy scorecard, if we come back to that and add user activity monitoring to it, you can see that user activity monitoring has a huge play. If someone's writing bad checks and fraud, we're going to see them writing the bad checks in the accounting system. If they're committing data theft by copying 100,000 documents to the USB drive, you see that. If they are breaching compliance, again, the example of they hit the print screen inside the medical records app and they shouldn't be, you see that. If they're goofing off on Facebook and ESPN and watching videos and whatever, you see that. And this is the one solution, this type of solution is the one thing that's going to provide you the ability to detect when the enemy is doing something in real time. So in kind of summary, the enemy has a profile. They're from specific departments. They're always using their computer. They act very quickly. This takes, again, seconds to minutes to hours. It's very, very short amount of time frame. And so the response requires many solutions in play. All the ones we talked about today are necessary as a response to both proactively and reactively address this issue. But detection is a critical piece to it. So I hope that you've gotten something out of this presentation. Please be sure to stop by our booth. We do have evaluations of our software available for free download. Dan, I think we got a couple of questions, and there's a survey we're going to do. So why don't we jump into that, and maybe you can help me start with that.
Yeah, Nick, thank you so much for the presentation. Yep, we are up to Q&A right now, so keep those questions coming in. Before we begin that, let me ask a question to our audience that you can vote on. Which of the problems mentioned in today's webinar are you facing today? Select all that apply. Corporate fraud, data theft, compliance breaches, or employee productivity. So take a second to vote, and we'll check on those responses, and we'll jump into the Q&A right now.
Nick, here's one. Since you gave SIM highest ranks next to activity monitoring, how are they different?
That's a great question. So, it's kind of funny. I like to think of user activity monitoring as sort of the anti-SIM, and I'm going to define that. That doesn't mean it's going against SIM, but it's sort of doing it in the exact opposite direction. So, as I said before, SIM is, of course, taking all this disparate data from multiple systems and pulling it together and trying to build together what the individual was doing. And so user activity monitoring is kind of exactly the opposite. It's watching what the user...
Possibly more of a worry than some of these security threats we hear so much about?
It's funny. The answer is kind of a yes and a no. I would say yes, it's surprising given the nature of this particular e-symposium being on insiders with access. But when I look at what's going on in the, I guess IT as a general rule, general sense, looking at the news articles, what businesses are actually really concerned about, where you're seeing data breaches, data theft, and so on, it doesn't entirely surprise me because it always seems to be when it comes to corporate fraud and data theft, because we see it happen so much, so often. Even hopefully the listeners here, you guys have seen articles about someone lost a laptop and then there was 20,000 records on it or whatever, and yet you still don't have literally the most basic fundamental things in place, like let's put encryption on every laptop, so at least the drive is secure. So it doesn't entirely surprise me because it seems like businesses aren't really worried about it. It's kind of a it's not going to happen to me kind of approach, and unless from on high in the organizational structure someone deems we need to lock down fraud, we need to lock down theft. Compliance makes sense because it's already been coming down from on high, and productivity is always a big concern. So again, kind of a yes and no question there.
Okay. We apologize. I know some people lost some audio, and I believe we're back online right now, so we apologize for that technical difficulty. But we're answering some questions here with Nick, our speaker, so keep those coming in. We got about a couple minutes left. Nick, let me ask you this one here. And this one from one of our audience members really speaks to there being so many various technologies out there, and probably hearing that so many of these threats, one technology needs to answer to another threat, and then you got to use another technology for something else. So the question is, are you suggesting I need to replace my rather significant investment in DLP, AV, and network monitoring with a UAM solution?
Okay, that's a great question, and let me actually broaden that person's question out just a little more to say, am I trying to pitch and say user activity monitoring needs to replace everything? Because obviously I give it these awesome ranks in that scorecard in terms of its application, and the answer is definitely not, because it's in this case user activity monitoring does have its limits. It is a detection type of solution. It's monitoring for a reason, to detect, but then also to replay and allow you to go back and view what somebody did. But it's not going to replace, certainly not going to replace IAM, right? You need to have your identity and access management in place to make sure that people are accessing the right thing in the first place. Extremely proactive technology. DLP, need to block. Why? UAM doesn't block. Network monitoring. The network monitoring is still used for a lot of other facets as well. So I don't think it replaces that, and certainly not SIM either. So it's more complementary, but I think it's going to have, if you're truly watching what employees are doing as the source of your threat, then this is going to be the key detection solution that would be as part of the arsenal of the other solutions that we've discussed today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And does this particular solution speak to the we're hearing so much now that you need to assume compromise. The attackers are going to get in, or there's going to be some malfeasance committed by your trusted insiders, and you need to assume that's going to happen, and then kind of catch them in the act, try to limit the damage. Does UAM technology and some of those others I just mentioned speak to that? Are we seeing sort of an evolution?
Are you talking about, though, just purely an insider with access type of scenario? You're talking about someone externally gaining credentials and that kind of thing?
I mean, I guess both. I just think Just kind of away from the more mainstay technologies now to the point where there's so many people accessing the network through various endpoints that already have privilege, and then you have external attackers who are finding it quite easy to get into a lot of these organizations. So does the sort of mindset need to change? And then we, as a result, we see technology such as UAM really kind of answering the call.
That's a good question. So in the case of truly an insider with access, this is very much answering the call, who's providing a higher level of detail that the other types of solutions don't provide. If it's a more of an external attacker, even using insider credentials, but it's an external type of attacker, UAM is not the solution for that type of scenario. They'll figure out what level of detail they want in their screen snapshots, anything from like a 1-bit monochrome all the way up to 32-bit color and everything in between. And then on top of that is the issue of how frequently you take screen snapshots. By default, like in our case, it happens to be every 30 seconds. Other vendors might be different. And you can specify how often you want them to be taken. But that helps with the disk space issue and network traffic issue, but also the downside of that is that alerting comes into play when someone triggers a particular keyword or alert or something in an application, or they type it in, or it's on a web page or whatever. You can specify, I'd like to take, let's say, screen snapshots every second for the next 30 seconds. So you get this really nice detailed video of the particular event in question that is probably a lot more of value than them just doing their job inside of writing something in a Word doc or whatever that has no bearing whatsoever to security. So there is an ability to handle that data that way, and then, of course, it's stored in an SQL server. It can be archived out if you want, or cleared out as the demands need of the organization.
Okay.
I did see one last question real quick that I'm gonna jump in here just as someone asked about the slides being available. If you just email me at nickc@spectrasoft.com, I'll be happy to get you a copy of the slides. So I just thought I'd throw that out there real quick.